Welcome, my name is Sue Walgar. I'm Secretary to the Hampshire Archives Trust. Thank you for viewing this video, which was screened as one of our talks in the joint programme of events that Hampshire Field Club and Hampshire Archives Trust put together. You'll find that most of the talks that were given are now available on the YouTube channel. Look for Google Hampshire Field Club YouTube and you'll find them there. But our speaker this evening, I'm delighted to tell you a little bit more about him. David Taylor was the head of, has worked in education for some 25 years in secondary education, and then moved into educational publishing, managing the history list for a large international company. He's written a number of school history textbooks and worked as a senior GCSE history examiner for 3 national examination boards. Now retired, I suspect he's going to tell us he's busier than he's ever been, which is what most of us say. David has recently published The Life and Times of the Reverend Robert Wright, a clerical magistrate from Itchen Abbas. He learned a great deal about the work of the Hampshire magistracy while researching that book, and is now going to tell us a lot about it this evening, which I'm sure very few of us know much about. But he is also working currently on Itchen Abbas itself from 1815 to 1914 as a community in the Upper Itchen Valley. David is also going to give us a great deal on his new book, or his recently published book. Normally retails at £10.99. He's going to offer it to us for £7.50. If you would like to email him, he will tell you all about how to do that. And his email is wdkay@hotmail.com. So before I hand over to David for this talk, which was given in March 2021, I'd like to just remind everybody that the presentation is free, but that you can, if you're not already a member of either Hampshire Archives Trust or Hampshire Field Club, you can join. And if you would like to make a donation for what, as I say, is a free talk this evening, you're very welcome to do so. We welcome all donations, and you can do that through either of the organisation's websites. The talk lasts for about 35 minutes and will be followed by questions and answers. I hope you enjoy the talk that's about to come. Thank you.
Let me introduce you to the Reverend Robert Wright, who was a pluralist clergyman from Itchen Abbas who lived between 1772 and 1850. He also served as a county magistrate from 1808 until his death, making an extraordinary contribution to the work of the Hampshire bench. Wright was also a pillar of the establishment and a traditionalist who opposed change. And I'm going to use Wright as a lens through which to view the unrelenting work of the Hampshire JP. Wright left no private papers, so some of the sources used in this investigation will be highlighted as we go along. At the head of the county was the Lord Lieutenant, and from 1820 to 1852, this happened to be the Duke of Wellington, who lived at Stratfield Say. Those wishing to be a magistrate had to gain entry to the Commission of the Peace by having their name put forward to the Lord Lieutenant. And the minimum requirement for this was the ownership of freehold land worth £100 per year. Those approved had their names forwarded to the Lord Chancellor, who would normally just rubber stamp the decision. And undoubtedly, many people who had land wanted to get onto the Commission of the Peace because it brought them social status and social kudos, and they didn't need any legal training at all. However, to operate on the bench, be active, you had to swear an oath called a dedimus potestatum. If we look at the Hampshire Commissions of Peace here, this was updated every 5 years between 1800 and 1850. And if somebody died, they just struck the name through and then added a new name over the top of it. There's about 7 large sheets like this that make up the commission. And the dedimus problems. The dedimus looked like this. This is Robert Wright's dedimus potestatum, and it was sworn in the Fleur-de-Lis Inn on the 17th of December 1808. That's the Wickham Arms now. Wright's distinct signature you can see at the bottom here, and really it just affirms that he has the correct amount of land to act as a magistrate. Well, the work of the JP was unpaid, it was unrelenting, and there were two sides to it. On the right-hand side, we've got the administration, on the left, the judicial role. In the judicial role, a magistrate could operate in his own parlour, act alone. If he had a complaint, he could dish out punishments, issue warrants for arrest, and also send offenders up to the quarter sessions. Another way of acting was to sit in petty sessions, which was sitting with at least one of the magistrate, normally in a hotel or an inn in a market town such as Romsey. And they introduced petty sessions because of the rising crime, and they were held perhaps once every 2 weeks. If they had serious offences or habitual offenders, then they were referred to the quarter sessions, which met 4 times a year. Well, I've listed some of the jobs that they had to do to administer the county, and you can see there's a long list there. It would take a long time to go through it. But if you look at the top one, the county rate, they were responsible for raising the county rate, setting it, and spending with the budget. Now, if you consider these guys were volunteers, they were amateurs, that was a huge responsibility. They also had to supervise the jails, the asylums, license inns and playhouses, regulate wages and fares, supervise roads and bridges and the poor law. And this brought them into contact with the parish officials. Also, these were amateurs as well, chosen by the parish vestries. There were overseers of the poor, way wardens and constables. They're all worth highlighting because they had to do this job as well as their day job, and the amount of efficiency varied greatly. Some constables, for example, were often lax in making returns to the county treasurers that were required. But you can see that's a lot of hard work. The Hampshire quarter sessions were always held in Winchester, which was a problem for JPs if they lived on the Isle of Wight, particularly before the advent of railways. They were held every Epiphany, Easter, Midsummer, and Michaelmas. JPs did not have to attend, it was not obligatory, and if they did attend, then they could leave the proceedings at any time that they wished. Normally they lasted 3 days, and the normal pattern was to start with administration, so they would set the rate, look at the accounts for the previous quarter, hear reports on finance and jails, and debate any issues of the day. Appeals against removal orders and bastardy orders were then heard, and finally they got round to hearing the trials, which were heard before a jury. Now, there was an issue around clerical magistrates at the time. Just before Wellington became the Lord Lieutenant in 1819, there was what was known now as the Peterloo Massacre, which took place at St Peter's Fields, Manchester, August the 16th, 1819. Clerical magistrates played a big role in that. They read the Riot Act and ordered the yeomanry to charge into the large crowd of women, men and children with sabres drawn. And for this, they got lampooned in the radical press, particularly by cartoonists such as George Cruikshank. It was the sort of, people saw a conflict in the role. How could you save souls on a Sunday and then hang the souls, those same souls, on a Monday? So the Duke of Wellington made his attitude clear. He didn't really want them on the bench, but he had to put up with those who were appointed before he came to be the Lord Lieutenant. Now, in the Hartley Library in Southampton University, we have the Wellington Papers, and these have been transcribed and put onto a database by the archivist there, and also summarised. If you just put Wellington Papers into Google, it comes up. And this is a letter that is received from the Duke of Buckingham Chandos of Abington House, and Chandos is asking for the Reverend Charles Bonnet, the rector of Abington, to be put on the Commission of the Peace. Wellington refuses because he doesn't think he has enough land, he's not high enough in status, and he doesn't really feel they can do a job unless there's a shortage in an area. Well, if we look at the reality, I took the Quarter Session order books and together with the Hampshire Chronicle and the Hampshire Advertiser, made a database of every attendee at Quarter Sessions between 1810 and 1850. And in the top 7, 3 were clergymen. Robert Wright, himself at the top, he only missed 4 Quarter Sessions in 40 years, just an extraordinary record. And not far behind was the William Hill Newbolt of Morstead and the Reverend Edmund Porter of Winchester. Both those made a huge contribution, but really Wellington would have preferred men like Sir William Heathcote and Sir Thomas Baring near the bottom, who were aristocrats. They had land that brought in more than £10,000 per year in rent, and the other members there are members of the gentry really, who would be at the lower end of the scale. And also from that same database, I could work out the average attendance of JPs at Quarter Sessions between 1810 and 1850. It comes out at 32.4, and the best attended was Epiphany, 1843, 127 gathered. And there was a big issue there because they were going to appoint the second Chief Constable of the Hampshire Rural Police Force. The lowest attended was 14, and that low attendances like that were common. So if we say there was roughly 350 named in the Commission of the Peace, but only roughly half of them were fully qualified, you can see that the burden of administering the county and keeping the peace fell on the shoulders of a dedicated few. So that I'll put my sources underneath there. The Quarter Session order books, they're like minute books. They're very huge, big volumes. And I sat in the record office and photographed all the relevant pages to make the database. Also in the record office, on the open shelves in the search room, photocopied are the calendars of prisoners. And these are extremely useful for finding out how magistrates work, the sort of people that came before them, and also the punishments that were handed out. So there's a full run of these. They run from 1800 to 1850, and there's only about 4 years missing. So they show the name of the convict or the person up before them, and these calendars were like little pamphlets, and they had the names and the offences and the punishments of all the people who were to appear at the next coming Quarter Sessions. So the database looked like this. This is a screenshot. It can altogether there's about 3,000 entries, and I've got the sessions, the dates, the offence. I coded these. Number 6, for example, is bastardy, and you've got the gender, the age, and also the convicting magistrate or magistrates, and then the sentence that they received. I made a mistake with this to everybody because I didn't put the name of the offenders, and I wish I had done now. I think I did that for reasons of privacy, but I think it was an error. But if you use that database, then you can find out all sorts of things. You can squeeze it like squeezing a lemon. And I looked at here, for example, the main offences tried at Quarter Sessions between 1809 and 1849, and in percentage terms, theft is by far the biggest one. And there's some really quite interesting cases. For example, sometimes when they were leaving the workhouse, inmates there, they carried off the bedding with them. I don't know how they managed to do it, but they were then brought before the magistrate. And some employees of Robert Wright even pinched things from his household, and that was not a very wise thing to do, I can tell you. Next down we have poaching, which you would expect in a rural county. Vagrancy was also a big problem for the county, and misdemeanours such as drunkenness and lewdness, and then finally assault. But there's many others as well. Those are just the top 5. And I have to say, this is just quarter sessions. We don't know really what happened fully at petty sessions, because the records aren't very good at all. And when magistrates operated in their own parliament, they didn't have to keep any record. There are about 6 or 7 that I know of, justice in notebooks, where JPs working on their own kept records in other counties, but unfortunately there isn't one for Hampshire that I know of. And then also you can follow Wright and his footprint, and he got all over the county. The amount of travel he must have done was quite extraordinary. If you look under the parish catalogue for, you'll find the poor law records, and they're very hit and miss. And for example, Itchen Abbas has no poor law records surviving at all. But you do come across documents like this, which is a removal order. There are 4 or 5 that are surviving for Robert Wright. Here he's operating in Ovington, which is one of his parishes, and is sitting with Walter Long, a fellow JP. A young couple have been brought before them. There's been a complaint from the overseer of the poor. James and Elizabeth Hunt have claimed relief, but they don't have a settlement, it's thought, in Ovington. So the 2 JPs examined the couple and determined that their rightful place of settlement is Martyr-worthy, and therefore their removal is ordered to Martyr-worthy. And you can see Robert Wright's distinctive signature at the bottom there. And also, we've got some poor law account books surviving, none for Itchen Abbas, and these are very patchy as well. But Avington, nearby to Itchen Abbas, has got 2 beauties, 2 really nice account books. And this is for Avington 1821. This is another job of the magistrates, to go round to each parish and audit the accounts basically and sign them off as correct. And at the bottom we've got Robert Wright's signature, and he's working here with William Hill Newbolt, who we've already met. Now, so far, perhaps we've given the impression that everything worked smoothly, but it didn't. There were lots of problems, and one of them was fiddling, for want of a better word. And this letter that I have here has survived by accident, really, but it's an absolutely beautiful source. There's 3 sides of invective from Robert Wright. He's writing to Sir Thomas Baring in April 1821 and describing an event that took place in the previous year when he was on the way to Berkshire along what is now the modern A34. Round about the Whitchurch area, he met an old lady sitting by the side of the Turnpike Road. So he stops his carriage, gets out and asks her what she's doing there. And she says she's been told to stay there and wait for the pass cart to return to take her on a journey. And what transpires is this lady is a vagrant. She's been brought from Shropshire down to the Hampshire border, where a Hampshire magistrate organised a pass cart to take her through the county to the Dorset border. And what clearly has happened, as Wright finds out on his return journey when he sees her still sitting there, is that she's been abandoned. The carrier has left her there, but gone back to the magistrate, claimed his money, but hasn't done the job. And Wright, this is the sort of thing that made Wright very, very angry indeed. But I think it was happening quite a lot. But there was an even bigger examples of fiddling, which involved the Hampshire County Treasurer, George Hollis. He'd been the County Treasurer since 1790, And in 1823, the accounts were examined by the Finance Committee, one of whom was Robert Wright, and they were signed off as accurate. But then when they were presented at quarter sessions, it was found that there were some inaccuracies in there and some anomalies. And they actually found that money that should have been going into the county account was in fact finding its way into George Hollis's private account. Now, Hollis claimed that he was innocent, claimed that it was just a genuine mistake, but this row rumbled on for 6 years and was played out in the local press. And here I must highlight that I could not have done this work without using a website called the British Newspaper Archive.co.uk, which has many digitized local newspapers on there. You have to pay to use it, but it's well worth it. In the meantime, Wright, who was one of the magistrates who signed off the original accounts, kept a low profile. But when they voted to dismiss Hollis, he voted in favour. So it shows that he was could be quite a slippery character. Now this brings us to the seminal year, that a watershed year really, 1830, because in 1830 the agricultural riots took place, often known as the Swingbrights. 1830 got off to a bad start for the Hampshire bench, because there was a row in Havant amongst the local JPs there about how best to run the petty sessions. It was quite unsavoury, but worse was to come with the Swingbrights in 1830. They started in Hampshire on the 18th with gangs of agricultural labourers wandering across the county, particularly in the central belt, in the chalkland areas, smashing threshing machines, extorting money from rectors and clergymen, and generally being threatening, and then covertly at night committing acts of arson. They had suffered distress for many years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 in particular, and they were asking for a wage of 12 shillings per week. Well, this particular incident really highlights the vulnerability of the magistrates, because they weren't expecting it at all, and their response was uncoordinated and patchy. Some of them tried to use the carrot method, whereby they would try and talk to them. For example, Newbolt did this. He hired a carriage, although he was in bad health, and went out to Sutton, Scotland, and stopped a gang who were on their way to Stratton Park, and promised them that they would be paid 12 shillings a week. And for that, he was chastised by Lord Melbourne a few weeks later for being too soft. Some of them, though, were just totally cowed. They froze, they didn't know what to do. But this was not the case with Wright. Robert Wright, in particular, confronted the labourers on 2 occasions. One was when they appeared in Itchen Abbas and they smashed the threshing machine at Manor Farm, and then were making their way to Abington House, when he intercepted them, rounded up the ringleaders, called for troops from Winchester to take them back to the jail. And in the National Archives, in a file called HO 527, which has been digitised, and you can download this from the internet, there's a whole file of letters sent to the Home Office, which include quite a lot from Hampshire magistrates, including Robert Wright. And this one here, I'll read a transcript to you. It's dated the 23rd of November. It took a day to get to London. My Lord, we think it necessary to inform your Lordship a considerable disturbance has taken place in various parts of the county, and the troops have been sent into the disturbed districts. The number of prisoners now in confinement in the jail for rioting amounts to 100. We will transmit to your Lordship further intelligence tomorrow. So this captures the drama and the immediacy of the crisis that they were facing. The letter is signed by Wright, this is Wright's handwriting, and also by Samuel Wall of Worthy Park and William Heathcote of Hursley, who we have met before and will meet later. Wellington at the time was out of the county and he didn't appear until the 23rd of November. He'd just been deposed as the Tory PM, and he was obviously clearing his desk. When he arrived in Hampshire, Richard Pollen had already organised a meeting of the Hampshire JPs to discuss what they should do, which was chaired by Wellington. The local historian Ruskin Foster, who's researched the Duke of Wellington, is very critical of the part that Wellington played in these riots. 74 JPs attended this meeting, including Heathcote on the left, and also Robert Wright and Sir Thomas Baring and others, including Daniel Poirier. And they issued this handsheet as a minutes of the meeting, in which they chastised and criticised the labourers, told them that justice was on the way and they would be made to pay. And the way that they were going to do this was to have a special commission of the Assizes at Winchester in the following December. So they weren't very sympathetic, and they were very determined, as they said, to play the role that they'd been appointed to play. So the Special Commission meets in the Grand Jury Chamber in December 1830, starting on the 18th of December. And all of these prisoners had to be processed. You can imagine that. JPs had to sit in petty sessions, really, examine them, question them, decide if there's enough evidence to push forward to have them tried. And that must have taken an awful lot of doing. Nevertheless, at the top, from another database, we have the ones who made the biggest contribution to the convicting. Sir Thomas Baring, he played a part in 69, and Robert Wright again in 65. And I used Jill Chambers' book, Hampshire Machine Breakers, which is very, very good because it summarises all the trials, which are quite difficult to follow in the newspapers. The reporters couldn't keep up with the amount of evidence that they were hearing. And even though there was a system of shorthand at the time, they did make mistakes. They got names wrong, for example, and it's quite muddled, the coverage. But Jill Chambers puts it all into some sort of order, and it's a very valuable book indeed. And from her book, from my figures, I worked out these punishments handed out: 108 transported. They could be transported for 7 years, 14 years, or for life. 79 imprisoned, but quite a few of them were let off. 76 acquitted, 44 just bound over, 25 discharged, and no bill where the jury decided there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. But at the bottom, we've got the chilling figure of 5 executed. And some of these actually didn't appear at the commission. They were caught later on in 1831. But one of those executed was Henry Cook. This is a very sad story. He was a young ploughboy from Lichfield Heather. He was aged 19. He got caught up in the riots and he got carried away, and he aimed a blow with a sledgehammer at William Bingham Baring, who was later to become the second Lord Ashburton of Northington Grange. Caught him a glancing blow. He wasn't, I don't think he was badly injured, because he was seen walking in Winchester the next day, but he was arrested, and when he was tried, they put that it was attempted murder. He was found guilty, and he was hanged on 15th of January behind the Jury Street jail, now that the well-known public house, in the yard. And the account is from the Hampshire Advertiser there. It's a chilling account, and every time that I've been in that public house, which is not very often, I always think, what was happening there nearly 200 years ago. Well, this brings me to a source that you wouldn't really think had anything to do with magistrates at all, but in actual fact it's a beautiful source. It's the Select Committee on the Sale of Beer, 1833, and in 1830, in July, just before the riots, the Beer Act had been passed. The Beer Act gave the right for anybody to start up a beer shop. They could have it in the front room of their house if they wished. They just had to pay 2 guineas to the Customs and Excise, and they took off. Soon there were hundreds all over the country. And also, if you had a beer shop, you could brew your own beer, which would be cheaper. That was the idea of the Act, to stop the power of the big breweries who were monopolising the trade. But it didn't have the desired effect, according to the magistrates. Magistrates resented them because they were bypassing one of their powers, which was to licence public houses, and they didn't need a licence from a magistrate. Well, the chairman of this select committee was the Marquis of Chandos, who was to become the second Duke of Buckingham and Chandos in 1839, and he was a very close friend of Robert Wright. Robert Wright had known him since he was a teenager, and they were very close associates. Wright was the first one to give evidence, and he was asked 296 questions, and he just pulls it all out. Now, I think you've got to use a little bit of evaluation, because there was a tendency to exaggerate, but basically he says that the riots have traumatized him. I believe I shall feel the riots to the day of my death, he tells Chandos. And then he goes on to say that the riots were caused by the beer shops, because he claimed that in the beer shops there was a lot of drinking going on, and the labourers, the agricultural labourers, were radicalised by the likes of carpenters and cobblers, who would go into the beer shops and read Cobbett's Weekly Register to them, but also another newspaper called the Poor Man's Guardian, which was readily available in Winchester, and it was pro the labourer, anti-authority, and used very threatening language in its reports. And it frightened the magistrates, to be honest with you. The aftermath of the riots saw a mood of tension, and Wright says that he told the Select Committee he sat every day for 6 weeks pursuing arsonists in the Deva Valley and gathering enough evidence to bring them to trial successfully. And they were included in the 5 executions that you've just seen. He explained that Easton, across the river from Itchen-Abbas, was a problem village with much dissent and many idle drinkers in the beer shops, 3 of them there. But Itchen-Abbas, by contrast, he brags, had no beer shop at all. And in fact, he said, there's been no cases of bastardy this past 20 years, as though he was responsible for it. Wright he told Chandos that 10 shillings a week was plenty for a family to exist on, unless the male drank it all away in the beer shop. Beer shops to him had caused the riots. He did not think the labourers were poorly paid, and neither did he take into account that there'd been a run of poor harvest prior to 1830, and labourers quite honestly were finding it difficult to put food on the table for their family. And also, in the aftermath of these riots, during the early 1830s, political unions were formed, and the Winchester Political Union was particularly radical. It met in the beer shops, and it put fear into the magistrates. It was after the reform of Parliament, of course, and extending the riots. Now, of course, many magistrates opposed this, Wright did in particular, and he actually paid a number of spies to go visit the beer shops to gain evidence. If there was any talk about the reform of Parliament, they reported back to him, and then in turn, Wright reported it to the Duke of Wellington. He all comes across as a bit of a rural despot, really. And when you think that if a magistrate lived in the community that he served and people were knocking on his door with complaints, you have to ask yourself, how could he face these people if he had such a hardened attitude to them? And certainly, if he had any sort of relationship with the labouring classes before 1830, the Wrights certainly put pay to that. His relationship with the labourers had really broken down, which was not really a good situation for a magistrate. Now, there were other things as well that followed in the wake of the riot. There was quite a lot of soul searching amongst magistrates. Crime started to increase, and the benches, the Hampshire bench in particular, had lost confidence in the local constables. They just didn't think that they could do the job. There was too much work for them. And they therefore took advantage of the County Rural Police Force Act in 1839, which was passed by the Whig government, and it gave local authorities the power, it was permissive in character, to set up a rural police force. Now, this was debated at length in Quarter Sessions, and it was pushed by a number of forward-looking gentlemen, shall we say. William Sturgis Bourne, Charles Shaw Lefebvre, Sir Thomas Baring and Sir William Heathcote were very much in favour, and the main opposition came from Robert Wright. He said it was going to cost too much to the rates, it was too expensive, but also he resented the fact that central government was now interfering in the role of the magistrate locally. And traditionally, magistrates had always had a lot of autonomy, and they could use a lot of discretion in their decision making. So it was resented by some of the traditional magistrates. When it came to the vote was won by the Sturgis Bourne faction, and Hampshire became the second county after Wiltshire to have a county rural police force. And this was just for the rural areas. Wasn't for the towns and boroughs like Southampton and Portsmouth, just for the rural areas. And here's a few details about it. First Chief Constable Captain George Robbins consisted of 106 officers, so it's not many, comprising 14 superintendents, 91 constables and 1 chief constable. The annual cost of the rates was actually £7,000 a year. Wright had argued that it was going to be 12,000, but that was not true. But he led the opposition, which is extraordinary really, because he was also one of the magistrates who was complaining about the increase in crime as well. So it was a bit contradictory really. And then another issue came to the fore. In 1835, the Prison Act was passed by the Whigs, again from the centre, which had an effect on the local areas, whereby local jails and bridewells were to be inspected annually. This didn't go down well because traditionally local magistrates had always had the role of being visitors to jails and making their own reports. So this was controversial. The problem was in Jury Street, the Jury Street jail shown on the left here was overcrowded, and it needed renovation. The Bridewell was located in Hyde. In fact, they'd built it over the ruins of the old Abbey Church, more or less where the Remembrance Garden now is. And that was damp, it was dark, it was dingy, and it was unhealthy. And they were going to renovate that as well, but then they were advised it would be more economical if they scrapped both those buildings and built a new prison, completely state-of-the-art, based on the solitary system where each inmate had his or her own cell. And that is what happened. It was debated at length, and again it was Baring and Heathcote who was pushing for it. They passed the legislation and agreed to do this in 1845, and they more or less were taking something of a risk, but nevertheless by 1849 the new prison in Romsey Road was opened. It was £57,000 financed by Wrights and the government grants. Still in use today, so it's almost 200 years old and still being used. I suppose you could say it's a legacy of this period. Again, just to mention that all these debates, I'm following them in the local newspapers like the Hampshire Chronicle, on the British Newspaper Archive website. Couldn't have done it, really, couldn't have done this piece of work without these newspapers, but still used them with a little bit of evaluation, because of course they normally gave the view of the authorities, and if you want any alternative view, then you need to read any letters that are in there, and there's some good ones as well. And then finally, we come to the issue of mental illness, or lunacy as they called it. This has been discussed for many, many years on the Hampshire bench. They didn't know really how to deal with people who were mentally ill. Some of the poor ones were dumped in workhouses and basically left, and others were sent to private asylums such as Lainston House, in the grounds of Lainston House, and Grove Place in Nursling. But change was on the way, because Lord Ashley, the factory reformer, was onto their case, and in 1845 the County Asylum Lunacy Act was passed by, or inspired to be passed by Lord Ashley. The previous 2 years he'd had teams of inspectors going round to the private asylums, and they visited Lainston House, and it got a shocking report. It was dirty and very little was being done to help people who were mentally ill. So that now the county magistrates, their hand was forced, and the Hampshire Quarter Sessions responded in 1849 by voting to acquire some land at Knoll near Fareham, between Wickham and Fareham. And Wright, at the time, he was absent from this particular vote. By this time, in fact, he was acting very erratically, and probably, I feel, he had perhaps the start of dementia. So he wasn't in Quarter Sessions when this was voted through. And when it opened in 1853, at a cost of £65,000 to house 560 patients, he was, of course, dead. This is a photograph here when it was derelict, but now it has been converted into apartments and flats. Been round it, actually, is quite interesting. So if we come to some sort of conclusion about all of this, up until 1830, local magistrates had enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, but 1830 was a watershed. The riots really highlighted the faults and deficiencies in the system, and of course, all of this was exacerbated by the fact that there was an increase in population, economic, social and political change was going on, and also democracy was starting to evolve. Central government then started to interfere more in local affairs, and the job changed. It changed in character, and all of this culminated quite slowly, I suppose, in 1888, when county councils were put into effect and magistrates lost their administrative functions that now were to be carried on by elected councillors, but they still maintained their judicial function, of course. And really, one can say they'd had a good run for their money, and Hampshire's quite a good example of a bench in action. Obviously, this has been very selective, but I didn't realise there was all of this to it, and it's suitably increased my knowledge. And finally, just to put some publicity up about the next HSC talk is on Tuesday the 27th of April at 7 PM, when Jean Morin will be talking about parish histories, the Victoria County History Way. If you wish to join HAT or HFC, the email address is there. And if you want a copy, if you'd like a copy of the Life and Times of the Reverend Robert Wright, I'll be pleased to send you one at the discounted price of £7.50, which includes postage and packing as well. And just email Whiskey Delta Tango Alpha Yankee @hotmail.com. And I'm sorry about the computer going down at the start, everybody, but thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back now.
Thank you, David. That's much appreciated. Yes, and thank you for the plug for our next talk as well. That's well beyond the call of duty. As those of you who have been to these sessions before will know, that we invite you, David has very kindly said that he'll attempt to answer any questions that you have. So if you would like to submit any questions that you have through the chat button, I will then read them out to David if he can't see them, and ask him to respond to them. But while you're thinking about that, it's always a good move when the host has a few questions up their sleeves or observations up their sleeves to get the ball rolling. Clearly, these clergymen, JPs, as they weren't paid, they must have had quite either family money or very rich livings. Is that your experience? Well, right?
I think so, yes. I can only speak for Richard and Abbas, but it was a very desirable living. And in 1802, Robert Wright's father bought the advowson, which is the right to present the next incumbent, and then transferred it to Wright a few years later. He had, that included 80 acres of land, glebe land. So yes, he also had enough money to employ curates, because he had 5 parishes. He had Itchen Abbas, Ovington, Southwick, Borehunt, and then in Oxfordshire he had Steeple Barton. And it is said that he only visited that parish once in 40 years. He employed a curate and paid them £50 a year. But his son was his curate for quite a while between 1826 and 1836, the Robert John William Wright, who was much more liberal than his father, but he received £300 a year for being his father's curate, which most curates could only dream of. It was an extraordinary amount of money. But of course, if Wright was doing all the magistrate's work, I should imagine he was barely in his parish during the week time. But the evidence shows that he got around to most of them on a Sunday. He alternated. But in the 1840s, his clerical activity sort of dwindled. I genuinely think that he was running out of steam, and he did do some very funny things as well. For example, he was actually before the city magistrates for evading the toll at the turnpike on the northern end of Winchester. So he was very much a man who said, you know, do as I say rather than what I do.
Yeah. Was it law and order? Was that his reason for getting into his job as a JP, do you think?
I think it was more to do with status, because he genuinely enjoyed the state he was rubbing shoulders with, you know, the real aristocrats. And Sir Thomas Baring was a big chum of his, and it's remarkable because Wright, you might say, was a Tory, an ultra Tory, very much wedded to the old Georgian ways of doing things. But Baring, he was quite forward looking and a Whig, and politics, they seemed to brush. Politics were different, I think, because party politics weren't so established, I suppose, as they are now. So I think it was for the kudos that he wanted to be involved. But having said that, he put his heart and soul into it, you could say. But he could be paternalistic, but it was the sort of paternalism where it would be, I'll give you some money or help here, but in return you will be obedient to the system. and I think he was quite an old-fashioned gentleman in that sense.
Okay, I've got a few questions coming from other people. I don't want to hog the session. So there's a question which says, is there a list of those arrested and tried for their part in the riots, together with their ages and addresses?
Yeah, yes, there is. There is. The database that I made, there's a calendar of prisoners for trial at the Special Commission, and that's in the record office in the search room. They're photocopied and they're on the open shelves. So yeah, you can go and pick that off the shelf and look at it. That's interesting. I've got Jill Chambers in her book. She's got pen pictures of every offender and what they were tried for, where they committed their offence, what happened to them, and she even traces them to Australia if they were transported. It's a great book. But it's out. I think it's out of print now. But there is a copy in the record office, definitely.
Oh, right, Humphrey, we're rushing out to have a look at that one. I think there's an observation from one of our participants who says that the newspaper archive you mentioned is available on Find My Past, in case anybody wants to try and track it down through that method.
Yes.
And then we have a question which says, can you tell us what was happening before this? I assume he means before, well, I'm not sure. He says he's researching 1750. Before this, I don't think it's before the riots or.
Well, I mean, I didn't look at the late 18th century because I was focusing on Wright. But yeah, there are some records. For example, those that passed their dedimus. There's a in the quarter session records that they go back into the 18th century, and they will list magistrates who took their dedimus, where they had their land, and how much of it, and so that's one source. Then there's also the parish poor law sources, but I don't think they're very good for Hampshire. There's only about 8 or 9 parishes that have a good run of records, but there are sources. But I think the calendars might go back before then, possibly the quarter session order books as well. Yeah, I think you have to dig around quite a bit.
Mm. Okay, and then we have a specific one. Nothing like putting you on the spot, is there? There's a question in, did the Reverend Christopherdson of Penton Musey near Andover emerge in the course of your researches?
Yes, he did, yes. No, I know Christopher Dodson quite well because he was involved in the Andover workhouse scandal. And yeah, he's there, he's on the dedimus records, and he's also appears in the calendars, I think. Yes, he does. But he wasn't a regular attendant. I think he qualified in the early 1830s from memory. But yeah, he's around. Yeah, Christopher Dodson, a well-known man, of course, and for his role in the scandal in Andover.
Yeah, yes, it was a scandal, wasn't it? But it seems to have been smoothed over quite and forgotten about. Well, not forgotten, that's not fair, but there doesn't seem to be any lasting changes to the way the inmates were treated.
No,
that's probably a whole nother talk there, really, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think we're getting towards the end of the chats, but to give people time to say anything more, my knowledge of the Hampshire poor law, it comes largely through Southampton. I was an archivist there for many years, and I'm very interested to see what you put up about the JPs in the county, because the JPs in the city, I'm not saying they behave differently, but the record keeping was very different.
Yes.
They seem to be, I mean, this whole thing about, I mean, the one that really always amazed me was the settlement stuff. They have examinations of everybody moving into the city, and the dates escape me at the moment, but they get little potted biographies of everybody, because they're asking them, where have you come from? Where was your place of settlement? What dependents do you have? How old are they?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yes. It's for me, I like to, if I can, look at those from below, if you like, and consider their situation. They don't really have a voice. They're like women, because in all of this, of course, there's no women magistrates at all. So they don't have a voice at all. Robert Wright's wife, Elizabeth Wright, she's virtually silent in all of this. And there's quite a lot of research going on now, though, I think, to try and rectify these omissions.
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? As we were chatting at the beginning, there's a lot you can get hold of about the poor. There's a lot you can get hold of about people who commit crimes or misdemeanors, and there's a lot you could find out about people who are landed gentry.
Yeah,
but there's an awful lot of people that fall between those various sort of stratas of society, I suppose.
Yes, exactly.
Can I ask a question, Sue? My chat button doesn't seem to work. It's Barry.
Oh, yes, Barry.
Can you comment, David, on the attitude of JPs and the Lord Lieutenant, etc., to the Reform Act, the Great Reform Act?
Well, I believe that the Lord Lieutenant was anti-reform. Chandos, the Marquis of Chandos, he was a bit mixed, really, because he saw an opportunity with the Reform Act to put in a clause that benefited farmers and gave smaller farmers the vote. And Wright is silent on it, but I would imagine that he would have gone along with Chandos. The thing about reform, I think, doesn't come across all that much, but the political unions, Winchester and Hampshire wanted reform from the lower orders, did definitely, and there was a group of magistrates, one of whom was Wright, I can't comment on the others, who were against it, and would basically they would, and Wellington as well, that this is why he was wanting this intelligence from the beer shops. It's quite ironic that the beer shops caused all the seemed to cause all the trouble in their opinion, but they've been introduced by Wellington's government himself. So I can't go any further than that, really, on that one.
Okay, thank you. Any other queries from anybody, or shall we give David our fulsome thanks and let him go? I don't think there are any others. Someone is, I'm not quite sure why, but yes, Brian, if I can help you, will certainly get in touch with me. Email me at secretary@hampshirearchivestrust.co.uk. Okay, otherwise I will thank David very much now for his work this evening, and I'm so sorry you had technical problems. You kept yourself together incredibly well, and delivered us a lovely talk nevertheless, so we do appreciate that.